Okay, in this video we'll be looking at the firmware migration from enterprise to 3PCC via local TFTP server. This leverages actual physical licensing known as classic licensing. So the first thing we're going to look at is the licensing that's required for each phone that we want to migrate. There's two different SKU numbers for licensing. This one right here is going to be for the 8800 series phones, so it's going to be L-CP-E2M-88XX-CNV. So we need to purchase one of those licenses for each phone that we want to migrate. And if it's a 7800 series phone, then we need to purchase L-CP-E2M-78XX-CNV equal symbol. And again, one per each phone we want to migrate. This chart is actually offered or listed within the white paper for the firmware migration of the Cisco phone. So it's a document you definitely want to look at. It does get updated from time to time. And you just want to be prepped to make sure if there's any changes, any limitations, etc., etc. You don't have surprises during your firmware migration project. And then the next thing we're going to look at is support. So there's a couple different groups that you may need to contact for support depending what your situation is. This first group doesn't really apply for this scenario that I'm showing in the video. This is more if you have a Flex subscription, so this would be kind of the other direction. If we're going from 3PCC over to Enterprise, there's what is called a Flex license option. And for example, if you're doing that type of scenario and you're having issues retrieving your entitlements, then you would open up a case with the MCE, the Cisco My Entitlements team, and you just simply go to this site right here, and then you would go ahead and open up a case. And there's some additional information as far as what they would want included within the ticket that you're opening. For this specific video scenario, what we want to focus is kind of if you're having issues with the licensing. So for example, you purchase the licensing, but then you're having issues generating the licensing. The team you would want to contact is the Global Licensing Operations, also known as GLO or GLO. And you'd simply open up a case using this URL right here. There is a process when you purchase the licensing. What happens is you get an email with a pack number. And then in the email, there'll be instructions on how you take the pack number, and then you need to get the MAC addresses collected off of your phones. And the pack number with the MAC addresses are registered on the Cisco licensing site. And in return, that's going to generate a .lic file, the actual license file that you need to use for the firmware migration. So if you're having any types of issues with those steps or those processes, you want to go ahead and contact the Global Licensing Operations. And then the last team here would be for the physical phones. So if you're having issues with the phones themselves, the HCP address, you're having issues accessing the phones, for example, setting the alternate TFTP on the phones, or anything related to technical issues on the phones for the firmware migration, then go ahead and open up a case with a small business support team here. And then the next item is going to be a question. And I'm going to read this verbatim because it's a very important question. My customer purchased the wrong phone type and needs to migrate the phone to the call controller they have. Can we do this? No. Please contact point of sales to return the phones and order the proper phones for the customer. Cisco will not replace phones or migrate phones for customers that make a mistake when ordering our phones. So what this is saying is you want to be very cautious before placing an order for the phones to understand the SKU number that you're ordering. Is it the proper SKU number? So for example, there's two sets of phones that you can order. There's one that within the part number, towards the tail end of the part number, I'll say like 3PCC or MPP. Those are the phones you want to order for WebEx calling or third-party call controller. And again, those are classified as MPP and or 3PCC phones. If the phones are for Cisco Call Manager, CUCM, then you want to order the enterprise phones. The enterprise phones will not have any type of listing in a part number for 3PCC and or MPP. So that's something you want to be very careful, because this can be a very costly mistake if the wrong phones are ordered. Next thing we're going to look at is what phones are actually eligible for the firmware migration, meaning the hardware. Does the hardware support the firmware migration? You still need to purchase the firmware migration license, but not all the phones support the firmware migration process itself. So the three phones I would like to point out here is the 7821, the 7841, the 7861. If you notice, they have a specific minimum version. For example, the 7821, it must be version 3 or later. The 7841 must be version 4 or later, and the 7861 must be version 3 or later. So this is something you definitely want to look at if you have a fleet of phones. You want to validate, are the phones even eligible for the firmware migration before even purchasing any licenses or doing anything else. And you always want to go back to the white paper that I'm referencing here on the bottom, because things do get updated from time to time. So at the time you're looking at this video, things may have changed, and so always validate the information before starting your project based upon the white paper. And then in this scenario, what we're doing is we're using a local TFTP. So the TFTP computer is going to be at 192.168.2.10. The phone is going to be a DHCP client. And in this case, we're doing something known as a single-step firmware migration. And before 14.1.1 firmware, so 14.1 parentheses 1 firmware, you had to actually do 2 steps for the firmware migration. You had to migrate from the enterprise firmware to transitional firmware, which is like a middleware firmware, and then from the transitional firmware to MPP firmware. Starting with 14.1 parentheses 1, it's single step, meaning as long as the phone is on enterprise firmware 14.1 parentheses 1, you can then directly migrate over to 11.3.5 or 11.3.6. 11.3.5 is the minimum, and that's what I'm showing here. But you would probably want to upgrade to whatever is the latest firmware and or whatever is supported on your telephony service. So for example, currently WebEx calling is using 11.3.6. So if this is for WebEx calling, you would not want to migrate to 11.3.5. You'd want to migrate to 11.3.6. It wouldn't make sense doing 11.3.5, because when the phone registers to WebEx calling, it's going to see it doesn't have the most current firmware, and then it'll go again through another firmware update. So you want to minimize the steps. In any case, going back to this discussion, so if you have firmware that's below 14.1 parentheses 1, you would need to bump it up to 14.1 parentheses 1. So two methods of doing it. One would be CUCM. You'd bump up the firmware. So whatever version you have, let's say you had version 12 something, you'd want to bump it up. There's a lot of documents and videos online for that, so that should not really be an issue. However, where the issue potentially might arise is if you don't have CUCM, how do you upgrade the firmware? On my channel, I do have another YouTube channel. I do have another video that I show how you can use a local TFTP server with an XML file. It's actually this same XML file we're going to show in this video to bump up the firmware from older enterprise firmware to newer enterprise firmware. This is, by the way, sourced from CUCM. I'm going to show at the end of the video what this looks like. As far as the contents, if you need to generate it from scratch, you can use Notepad++ to generate it from scratch, or if you have access to CUCM, you can also pull it off of that. So going back to the structure of how we have it set up, so we have a computer running TFTP server application. The TFTP application is pointing to this folder on our hard drive as a root folder. And there's 3 main things we have there. We have the license, a valid license for this phone for the firmware migration. We downloaded the binaries for the 11.3.5 MPP firmware, and that's all of these files right here. When you unzip them, you basically get all these files here. And then the third item we have is the XML default.cnf file that I sourced from CUCM. And what's going to happen is in a moment here, I'm going to show you what we're going to edit in the XML default.cnf file. Basically, we're going to copy this right here, the file that ends with downloads, and we're going to replace or update one of the lines in this file. What happens is when the phone boots up and it's pointing to this TFTP server, one of the files by default it looks for that's already baked into the firmware of the phone software, the logic, if you will, is this xml.default.cnf file. And when it finds it, that instructs the phone what to do next. And in our case, we're going to be instructing the phone to go ahead and migrate itself over to 11.3.5 firmware. And this is actually from the release notes of this that talks about the one-step firmware migration without needing the transitional load. So if you would like to read the actual release notes for this firmware, you can find it at this site right here, and it'll kind of cover, you know, different updates or topics of it, etc., etc. Okay, so now we've opened up the XML default.cnf file, and we want to find the specific model of phone that we're going to be migrating in this case. In my case, I have an 8832, which is a speakerphone, a phone that's typically used in meeting rooms. And what we want to replace is this section right here. So we want to make sure this section between the greater than and less than symbols, this is XML format file, we want to make sure that matches this inner folder for the binaries we're migrating to. So basically what I do is once I zip this, we have this all in the folder, I'll go ahead and copy this whole file name, and then I'll go ahead and open up Notepad++, as you see here. I'll go ahead and find the model phone. You can do a Control F and type in 8832, and boom, it's on line 89 here. And then just go ahead and delete whatever was in there, paste in this new file name that ends with .load, just make sure it matches, go ahead and save it, and you're pretty much in business at that point of time. At the end of the video, I will show what the XML default.cnf file looks like in case you don't have access to CUSM, and it doesn't need to be CUSM 14. The reason I use CUSM 14 here is I have one of the other phones here is newer, and this had it within the XML file, so I wanted to make sure the latest XML file I had covers all the current generations of phones possible. Okay, and then on the phone itself, all we need to do is on the LCD of the phone itself, we're going to go to the, also known as TUI, telephony user interface. We're going to go to number 5 settings. And then once we go under settings, we're going to go to admin settings. And then we're going to go to network setup. And then we're going to go to Ethernet setup, IPv4 setup. And then we'll scroll down the LCD a tad, and there'll be a section that talks about TFTP, and we're going to make sure it's toggled to on state. And then right below that, so that's kind of this right here, what we're seeing on the menu, alternate TFTP. We're going to toggle it on, and then right below that, the very next item is going to be TFTP server 1. And then we just want to type in the IP address for the local TFTP server we have. And then you're just going to hit apply. And then you'll get a message. It may take 30 seconds or a minute, minute and a half, something in that range, but you should get a message eventually comes up. This is ready to upgrade. Device will restart in X amount of seconds, and basically just leave it alone at that point of time. Okay, we're going to go ahead and copy the downloads file, and then we're going to edit the XML default.cnf file in Notepad++. Let me go ahead and adjust this a little bit, and then we'll go ahead and find the 8832 phone. Okay, so let's replace the name of the firmware there. So we're going to go ahead and remove the current name, and then we're going to paste in the new name, which is 11-3-5 for the MPP firmware. And then next we're going to go ahead and take a look at, so I just saved it there, and then we're going to go ahead and what I'm going to do is let me go ahead and clear this so we have a clean slate. And we're going to go ahead and go to the phone now, settings, admin settings, network setup. Ethernet setup, IPv4 setup, and then we're going to go down the list here, and we're going to find the alternate TFTP. We're going to okay, so I had this actually from before, but in any case, you would type in the IP address of the alternate TFTP server, in my case 192.168.2.10. You would hit apply, and then generally the activity should be fairly quick. Okay, there we go. Generally, if you're not seeing activity within, from the TFTP server standpoint, within, I would say, probably like 30 seconds to about 2 minutes or so, it is possible that the, like a personal firewall, Windows firewall, I should say, on the computer that's running the TFTP server might be blocking the actual TFTP packets. So you want to make sure that that's allowing the TFTP packets from the phone to the actual computer that's acting as a TFTP server, or temporarily disabled Microsoft Windows Firewall, assuming your computer's in a safe environment, etc., etc. But if you're not seeing any activity and you know, let's say 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes has passed, there is another possibility. It could be that the phone is kind of stuck in an odd loop. So one of the things you can do is unplug the phone from the RJ45, assuming it's PoE, for a few seconds, plug it back in, and the phone will boot up again. It takes about a minute and a half, 2 minutes for the phone to boot up. You should see activity as soon as the phone goes into runtime or it tries to reach out to the TFTP server. If you're still not seeing activity, go ahead and reset the phone back to factory default. And once it's reset to factory default, you will need to go to the phone's TUI telephone user menu, just like we did a few moments ago, and enable alternate TFTP on, and then type in the IP address of your TFTP server. But you know, if you do run into an odd situation, that would be kind of the next step in the troubleshooting. Also, the other thing I wanted to note, if you notice in the TFTP D64 application, the server interface is showing loopback. That's more of a cosmetic defect with this software. Even though you put it on a drop-down, if we were to put it on the actual server NIC that we're using, it'll tend to always want to jump back to the loopback interface. You can ignore that. Again, that's more cosmetic, kind of annoying, but just how the app is. And then you should get these child windows that pop up like we have right now that are showing the horizontal bar showing the actual progress. Generally, what I have found for the firmware migrations, it takes about 4.5–5 minutes for the phone to ingest the firmware, and then it'll go ahead and reboot itself. And then once it reboots itself, it's about 1.5–2 minutes for it to come back into runtime. And then once it's back in runtime, you should get a menu fairly quickly. It may have like a checking network listing on the LCD of the phone, but after it finishes that, you should be able to go into the phone, and we'll look at it here in a moment, and check the actual settings of the phone as far as the status information. What is the firmware in the phone itself? The other item, if you're running into issues, is this is in pure clear text. So obviously there's quite a lot of useful information in the log tab here under log viewer within the TFTP D64 app. But also you could use Wireshark, so you could run Wireshark on the TFTP server, or you can do a port mirror and just look at the clear text as far as what the phone is trying to get versus what message the TFTP server is stating. Like, is there a syntax error? Is there an error as far as what folder the actual binaries are located at, XML file, etc., etc. Okay, let's go back to the phone. Okay, and okay, we'll give the phone a few more moments. It's just doing a check right now, configuration check, and as soon as it completes that, we'll go ahead and take a look at the settings on the phone to see what firmware it currently has. Okay, so we're going to go settings. Okay, so when you have a phone with brand new, so the 3 PCC phones do not have a default password, so you typically want to just hit skip there in any case. So let's go to status, product information. Okay, it's a 3 PCC phone, awesome. 1135, okay, excellent. So let's now take a look at the XML file. because I mentioned for this procedure we do need the XML file, which is sourced from CUCM, Cisco Unified Communication Manager. So if you don't have access to CUCM and you need to create this from scratch using like Notepad, I'm going to just kind of show here, and you can stop the video if you need to create this from scratch. I'll show the entire contents of the actual file, XML file. Again, this is sourced from CUCM 14. So as the recording of this video should have all the most current models of Cisco phones and also older phones listed. So this is something definitely you would want to leverage if you need to upgrade or migrate via local TFTP enterprise phones. So you're upgrading from older enterprise to newer enterprise, or you're migrating from enterprise to MPP, also known as 3PCC firmware. You would need to leverage this type of XML file. So this is why I'm showing this, in case you do not have access to CUCM. You can generate this from scratch. And you'll notice there's quite a lot of different phones listed here that have been created over time. There's some skinny phones, that's the SCCP. There are also some telepresence units, some SIP phones. Okay, well, thank you for watching this video. I hope this video helps with the firmware migration. Thank you.